Hello, AP. Here's the second part of what we were talking about for absolutism. So, the last time we talked about Western absolutism, and now we're going to talk about Eastern um, absolutism. So, there's really three different things here there's Western absolutism, then there's Eastern absolutism, and then there's constitutionalism. So, there you go. So, where we start, we're actually starting with something that sounds kind of unusual. We're actually starting with a Muslim empire in Europe with the Turks. And what we're during this time in Eastern Europe, we had like the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Polish Kingdom. There, add in Spain, are the sickle men. That these things are slowly dying. Um, Spain obviously is going to be the first one. That after the Treaty of the Pyrenees, that's the kind of the height or the decline, the sign of the decline, move from the height to the decline of the Spanish Empire. So this we're talking about the Ottoman Empire. Um, the Ottoman Empire is going to be slowly dying for several different reasons. One is that the trade routes had shifted. We were moving away from Mediterranean, hence why the Battle of Lepanto is so important. Is that when Spain wins that and gains control of the Mediterranean, it actually is not a success. Is that yes, they control vast amounts of the Mediterranean trade, but trade isn't in the Mediterranean really as much as it used to. Now we're talking about the trade in the New World was more important. And so the Ottoman Empire, even though they do have this free flow of trade moving through, we're going to see a a shifting of economic power away from. So the trade will help keep the Ottoman Empire going, but at the same time, it's a thing that's slowly dying off that's going to hurt them. Um, the Ottoman Empire also because they were the ones who had the science and the math and the technology when we came into the Renaissance. Well, now they're not keeping up, that we're not seeing the ideas of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and the Reformation and the scientific revolution is not impacting the Ottoman Empire as much. By the time they try to catch up, then they're not able to do that. So that's declining. Now, how then, if they're declining empire, why do they last all the way until 1918? One is because of economics, that there is still trade going through here. Two is that there's a concept of religious tolerance. You're going to see individuals like the Jewish merchants and the Spanish Moors are going to go into the Ottoman Empire because, look, I'm going to pay high taxes, right? Like we see the in the slide that there's going to be discrimination that they're going to have to pay higher taxes, but at least I'm not going to get executed. So that's the problem here, or the kind of the problem and solution at the same time. So the economic tolerance then and religious tolerance to a degree allows them to continue. There is some trade, like we said, flowing through. Second is that we're going to see an infusion of new blood. The Devshrim and the Janissaries are these boy tax. There's a child tax, and they're basically taking Christian children and moving them into the empire and using that as a new blood to keep the system going. The other thing that works, and by the way, the Janissaries are the military kind of elite forces that are trained and indoctrinated in Muslim ways. And then the other thing that keeps this empire going is that the bureaucracy works well. The millets, who are the local governors, are very inept, are very not inept. They're very positive, very well trained, and they can maintain order. There's a social structure that maintains order and keeps this moving. In another one, even though the sultans aren't always the most accurate or most wealthy, most talented. The last of the major significant ones would be Suleiman the Magnificent in 1520 to 1566, right? Which was probably at one time the most powerful ruler during the 16th century. He was going to move all the way up to Austria and take over most of the Balkans. But those sultans are an exception, not the rule. And so, what typically between the millets and the vizier, think Jafar from Aladdin, These people are the ones really running the empire. So there's a political stability that you're not going to see in other areas. So that's what's going to keep it going between the bureaucracy and the competent leaders, not rulers, leaders, and the viziers and the millets. The fact that there's still economic power flowing through here in trade, the fact that you have religious tolerance to the degree that brings in people that will keep working, that's what kind of keeps the Ottoman Empire going for as long as it does. And remember, this one's going to last until 1918, but they're not changing, they're not adapting. And economically, that's going to fade out eventually. The other thing that we're going to talk about is what you're going to see in Poland is that with the Liberian veto. So Poland was at one time one of the most economically and politically powerful areas in Europe. And the reason why it did is the same reason that the Italians were so powerful, and same with the Germans, is that the Holy Roman Empire, because it didn't have structure, allowed princes then to make their own rules, which then allowed trade to prosper and ideas. You have to remember, Copernicus and many of these scientific ideas come out of Eastern Europe. You're going to see economics flowing with the Fugars, who are the bankers in the German states. And in Italy, we obviously saw the Renaissance. But that same thing that kind of feeds these ideas, this lack of centralized power, is the same thing that's going to destroy these areas. Is that in Poland, the lack of structure, that all these nobles have power, and that the kings actually aren't even Polish. They pick kings from outside of Poland, and therefore there's not a threat to their political power. And then with the Liberian veto, that the Polish nobles then had to vote unanimously on any laws. And you're going to see this happens too in the Dutch, in that these in the Dutch, though, it's the wealthy merchants and ship owners that vote in their own self-interest and not the greater good. Same thing happened in Poland, that picking weak kings and then on top of it voting in ways that fit your desires, not national desires, weakens the state and basically left them open for invasion. That Poland is literally going to be swallowed by three other major powers, which by the Prussians, the German Prussians, the Austrians, and then of course Russia. And so they just take it over, and because they have lack of a centralized power. As far as absolutism, what's the biggest difference about absolutism in the East versus the West is who they're fighting with. In the West, Louis basically controls the nobility. He either pays he brings them in to court, right, and he controls and manipulates and watches them, or he has them pay their titles. And that, remember, that's the whole thing about Versailles and the nobles of the robe. But there's a growing middle class then that in many of these monarchies are going to use that middle class to maintain structural and political power. On the other side, we're talking about the Russians in Eastern Europe is the boyars. And the boyars, though, they economically and have a more an agrarian society. And so these nobles then in this agrarian society need the peasantry and maintain serfdom. So there's more of a direct conflict between nobles in the East as czars try to control the boyars. Whereas on the West, they're manipulating and controlling the nobility, but there's more of a growing middle class that's a danger. Whereas in the East, there's not that growing middle class that's the danger. And so serfdom is going to flourish in the Eastern Europe, in Eastern Germany, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Hungary. Serfdom still goes because of the economic issues, because it's a way of maintaining control over the nobles, that the czars will give them these serfs that can be slaves to their power. Well, that then is a tool of control, much like Louis XIV was using Versailles. Here they're using the peasantry to do this. This is what we call the robot, right? Was this idea? They even used the non serfs that were even forced into 3 to 4 days of work. This robot, and that was to control the nobles. And then in the East, though, in the West, you're done. They had the corvée, yes, and it was to a degree to placate the nobles, but it's only those peasantry classes, the rural peasantry classes. The urban areas just had growing middle class, which is lacking in the East. And so it all comes down to economics. In the West, you have this new beginning of trade guilds and exploration and the beginning of a proto industrial revolution. You're going to see an agricultural revolution, the enclosure movement happening in places like Germany and eventually in France, which either kills or severely threatens. It's a little hard to have serfdom in England when people can just pack up and go to the New World, or when your trade is mostly done at sea or eventually in factories. There's not really a need for serfdom. Whereas in Russia and these agrarian societies, there's a real demand for serfdom, and then it becomes a social, political, and class situation too, and a way of, like we said, to control the nobility. Um, so yeah, in the West, there really wasn't a need for it eventually. Now, granted, French will have the corvée, but that's one of the things that ends up causing the French Revolution. Whereas in the East, this is going to go all the way until the 1860s, where and then eventually, once it's gotten rid of, is because they're trying to industrialize and try to westernize. And to a degree, this is one of the things that causes the conflict in Russia that leads to the Russian Revolution eventually. So the other groups in the Habsburgs went from after the Treaty of the Pyrenees, and the last of the Habsburgs in Spain dies because he has no children. That's going to trigger a thing called the War of Spanish Succession, which Louis XIV, even though the French do get to put a Bourbon on the throne of Spain, they're not going to be able to unify those because England and France now are the major rivals. So the Habsburgs, who at one time controlled the Netherlands, controlled Spain, controlled the entire Holy Roman Empire, are now restricted to the Holy Roman Empire. And so that's that kind of, and by the time we get down to this, is that this is basically Austria and Hungary. And but there's problems here. Is that Spain, they controlled a unified state where they're all Spanish and they're all Catholic. But for the Holy Roman Empire, you had events that decide one, the religious conflicts like we saw in Bohemia when Ferdinand tried to redistribute Czech land to the aristocracy and soldiers. That's going to be one of the things that's going to trigger the 30 Years' War. We're going to see an intensifying of serfdom as they try to control these areas, but these areas can't really be controlled because you have multinational groups. The Austrians themselves are Germans and Italians. Um, the Czechs are Bohemian. They're German, but they're German Czechs. And then Hungary, you have Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, Romanians. In here, you have three different major religions. You have Protestants in Bohemia, you have Catholics in Austria, and in Hungary, you have Catholics, but you also have Serbs who are Orthodox, and Croats and Romanians who are Catholic. And so there's these different, and this is not counting even the subgroups here, and the Roma who can be found in these areas and the Jews. I mean, it's a box of cats that they is almost impossible to control. And so this is your kind of conflict here, your concept here. So and this the Ferdinand II we talked about. You heard about him. He's the one with the whole defenestration and the Danish, the you're trying to the order, the Edict of Restoration, where he tries to put the land all back to where it belongs, and then triggers the whole Swedes and Danes and all that. All right. And remember, the German states are in really bad shape after the 30 Years' War. Um, Ferdinand III, we talked, he's a little bit of the idea of heredity, provinces of Austria. This one's important. Leopold, he's the one who's going to stop Suleiman and the invasion and basically hold back. He's also the one who's going to establish Schönbrunn and what's going to become Maria Theresa and who's going to be an enlightened, to a degree, leader. And then we're going to see Joseph II, who's a really enlightened leader. Okay. So, but he's the one who holds the siege of Vienna. He's also part of the reason why coffee shows up in Europe, because of the siege of Vienna. So this is his palace, Schönbrunn. I've been here. It's huge. It's very much modeled after Louis XIV's Versailles. But here's the difference too. The picture alone tells you something because you see here Schönbrunn, and behind them is Vienna, whereas Versailles is 13 miles outside the city. And so here they see what's happening in the city. They can impact the culture of the city. They can impact the arts of the city. Whereas at Versailles, they're isolated and they don't see the real threat is those middle class people. And this is the Arboretum. This is inside Schulbrunn. So Charles the sixth, why he's important. Charles the Sixth is important not because of anything he himself did, but what he set up is what we call the pragmatic sanction. He only has a daughter to reign, and Maria Theresa will inherit when Charles dies. But to protect her and his empire, he went around and did this diplomatic action called the pragmatic sanction. It's a concept of treaties where all the neighboring states and threats to the power would agree to not try to take her land, and therefore she could pass it intact to her heir, well, and maintain the the Holy Roman Empire. Well, that's not going to happen. But here's her children, and we're going to talk more about Maria Theresa when we talk about enlightenment and enlightened rulers. And you'll notice this one, we'll talk a bit about that. So what's going to happen, however, is the War of Austrian Succession. Is that the Prussians, and we'll talk more about this one again, the War of Austrian Succession basically happened is Prussia then tries to take part of the land. And by doing this, by trying to take this, they trigger this War of Austrian Succession. They take this piece right here called Silesia. Um, why it's important is that when they do this, other countries come into the fight. The French enter in and support the Austrians. The English scrapping for a fight always after the War of Spanish Succession, once in so bad that they actually create a war reason. They basically walk into Parliament with an ear in a box that had been cut off by a Spanish sailor of an English lieutenant, and they used this, and this was years before this had actually happened, and they used that to gin up a reason to go to fight, and they call this the War of Jenkins' Ear. So the English come to war against the Spanish, which then theoretically means they're going to war with the French, who are backing the Prussians, and then the Austrians then side with the English, and this where well, the Austrians side with the French, sorry, the get this straight. The English side with the Prussians, the French side with the Austrians. And so in the end, when this is all done, the Prussians actually get Silesia, but there's a lot of bitter feelings though with the Prussian with the Austrians and Prussians because well, we'll look at the next slide, we'll explain that. But the French then side with the Austrians and form alliances. The Prussians form alliances with Great Britain. So you go from the War of Spanish Succession, where France and England now are butting heads over Spain, and now they're the main rivals. The War of Austrian Succession solidifies them with allies against each other, right? And then that leads you into the war, the 7 Years' War, which in American history was known as the French Indian War for a long period of time. And there's your sides. The English and the Prussians side on one side of the 7 Years' War, and the French and the Austrians on the other. And this is where the marriage of Marie Antoinette comes important because to solidify that bond, they marry her to the future king, who is Louis the 16th, which ties this into the French Revolution, both in economic reasons, political reasons, and now social reasons. All this in one little slide, all over this little piece of land, which is now part of Poland. There you go. Well, part of Poland, and I think this piece right. Yeah, that's all part of Poland. So there you go. All right. So now the rivalry though between Prussia and Austria is going to drive this thing called Großdeutsch and Kleindeutsch, is that with Prussia gaining more and more power out of the Treaty of Westphalia, and then eventually the Treaty of Utrecht, which ends the War of Spanish Secession, and then now out of the Austrian War of Secession. So you have Westphalia, Utrecht, and the Treaty of Paris. What's going to basically out of these treaties, Prussia now comes out as a major player in German unification. And then you have Austria down here, who also sees itself as a major player in German unification because they influence these states, Bavaria and all these. These, with Silesia and all these along the border with France, they influence these. And these northern areas like Hanover and all these are influenced now by the Prussians. The Prussians want to create this thing called Kleindeutsch, which means a unified German state. Germans, not Austrians, Germans. Okay. The Austrians, however, want to create something called Grossdeutsch, which means all Germans. So they want to unify all of these states into one huge, great German state, this whole thing. Whereas the Prussians only want to unify the German states and push Austria out. Now, in the end, in the 1870s, the Prussians will do that. Under Bismarck, they will create a unified Kleindeutsch German state. Whereas eventually, though, in the 1930s and 40s, an Austrian will create Grossdeutsch when he conquers all of this, the entire map. He conquers all of this except for Switzerland because nobody bothers Switzerland. That guy's Hitler, if you haven't caught the drift. Okay. So in Prussia, since we're talking about the Prussians, we see the Hohenzollerns. They're going to take this one little principality, and between the Treaty of Westphalia, the Treaty of Utrecht, and then the Treaty of Paris, they are going to create a huge, powerful state in the form of Prussia. This is Prussia, Brandenburg, Prussia. So these are the Habsburgs. These are the Hohenzollerns. That's what they're called. Okay. So the founder of this group is going to be called Frederick Wilhelm, who's the great elector. He's going to expand and create this thing called Brandenburg. We're going to see the establishment of a class called the Junkers, and then we're going to talk about what's the difference here. And he's establishes Prussia as a great, powerful place. And we're going to see the beginning of this idea of a militarization, that Prussia deems itself as a military power. And by doing this, they're going to influence basically all our states. At one time, there was a crayon called Prussian Blue, and because in every military on the world copied the Prussians. And so this militarism that becomes a part, the uniforms and the marching and the idea of political status through military force becomes a Prussian concept of honor, duty, and discipline, becomes very Prussian. We're going to see conflicts with Sweden and Poland during this time period. We're going to see the powerful Junkers become the backbone of the Prussian military force. And we're going to see a subjugation, obviously, of serfs during this time, too. Whoops, go too fast. The real kind of powerhouse militarism we're going to see comes under Frederick the First. We're going to see he tries to imitate Louis the 14th, who encouraged higher education, massive wars against Louis. We see with the War of Spanish Secession, and the League of Augsburg. We're also, though, like we said, that he sees himself as a soldier king. All right. He just double the size of the U.S. Doubles the size of the Prussian army and creates a bureaucracy that is highly effective. All right, and demands absolute obedience and discipline. Prime example is his son tries to run away with his best friend. He makes his son stand and watch as he tortures and beheads his son's best friend. So so they're going to establish schools to educate because he wants a good, strong military that's educated. That leads us to, of course, his son, who is named Frederick the Great. Frederick, who is highly educated, is an enlightened. We'll talk about that. Is seen as an enlightened leader. He brings in ideas of Voltaire. He brings in music. He himself was a musician and a poet. We're going to see the introduction of scientific ideas, but at the same time, he's a military powerhouse. He actually uses his army to cause the War of Austrian Secession. So he's kind of a little bit of both. He also allowed some limited ideas of religious tolerance in his state. So there's a little bit of both here. But one thing that's going to come out of this is a thing called the table of ranks, is that these Junkers have to earn their title either by serving in the military or serving in the bureaucracy. So Count so and so isn't just because he inherited, he's because he's the foreign minister. Um, Field Marshal whatever is Baron whatever, Field Marshal of the Prussian state. So he has to earn it on the battlefield. You just don't get it. So in France, you buy it. In England, who cares, because you want to be a landed gentry. You want the land and you're going to build fences and you're going to like do stuff like that. Nobility doesn't really matter. You get you a better table. In France, you buy it. Here, you earn it. See how that works? So this is Frederick the Great in his salons where they'd all get together and talk about the great ideas of the time. And there is Frederick's court, him playing music with his friends. So this is Europe in 1740, and this is our War of Austrian Secession. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle is what gave them this territory, right? And later the Treaty of Paris, which comes after this with the 7 Years' War. But like I said, this ushers in this idea of Austrian and Prussian power and this divide on who's going to create it, and sets us up for the 7 Years' War. And then here's the 7 Years' War, which was a global conflict, drew everyone in. And of course, it's important not only in Europe because it establishes England as a major naval power, it sets up the American Revolution, which is going to cause the French Revolution. It also establishes a, a conflict with Prussia that's in Russia that's coming, and then established. We'll talk more about this, and then you're also going to see um, that growing Prussian power. And this we'll talk more about the Treaty of Paris later. That's what issues into the 7 Years' War. So in Sweden, we talked about them. They're going to introduce themselves in the 30 Years' War. Overall, most of it is them trying to control the Baltic Sea, but you've got major powers such as Russia and the Prussians who are going to stymieing this, and Denmark eventually gets taken. Um, and we did Eastern Europe. We talked about the Liberium. Now, as far as the Far East with the Russians are a completely different thing. As Churchill called them, they're a riddle wrapped in an enigma. The Russians have been separated from the West for several reasons. One, they are not Catholic. They are not Protestant. They are Orthodox, which means they have a totally different religion than other Christians. They tend to pray to icons as a way to reaching to God. So these images, pictures or statues of God or Jesus or the Virgin Mary, that's who they pray to. And as praying to it, they're praying through it to the Lord. The patriarch of this is I mean, there's a head of the patriarch, there's a head of the church, but the actual head of the church is above the patriarch, is the czar. The leader is the head of the church. So in Russia, you don't have that conflict between church and state that you saw over in the Italians and with the Catholics, and in England with Henry VIII and the Catholic Church. They also have serfdom, like we said, which there's no reason to get rid of in their side because they're an agrarian society. It's a way of controlling the boyars. And then on top of it, for a long period of time, they were under Mongolian occupation until basically the 1400s, when Ivan the Great will throw out the Mongolians, and establish control to a degree over the boyars. So Russia was facing the wrong direction for a long period of time. And then on top of it, Russians have a long history of the strong central leader. And that gives them stability. But at the same time, many of these leaders who are strong also have fits of madness, like this nice gentleman, Ivan the Terrible, in 1533, 1582, or 1584. He is the grandson of Ivan the Third, and he begins to westernize them. All right. He controlled the Black Sea region. He gained huge amounts of territory. He conquers up to 25 miles a day. He takes over the Baltic regions in many areas. He tried to westernize Moscow, bring in trade. Um, he um, he has these armies that um, basically controls and spreads out. He introduces firearms. He deals with the Cossacks in this area. We'll talk more about them in class. But he has a real struggle with the boyars, and that struggle sometimes feeds his rage. And he has these moments of darkness that come out in him, even though he's pushing and westernizing. He's extremely paranoid because he'd watched members of his father's court tortured and killed. And so he then is enraged by these and constantly thinking that people are plotting against him. He asked the builder of St. Basil's here, the architect, if he could build another one. He has the man's eye spooned out, so there can't be another one. So he'd have the only one. He would take monks who spoke out against him and put them on kegs of gunpowder and then send them to the Lord, he'd say, as he lit them. He had one of the boyars he blamed for the death of his brother, had them eaten by his dogs in the Kremlin yard. Um, he he kills his own son because in a fit of rage when he didn't like his daughter-in-law and he thought she was embarrassing her son, and he goes in and he's beating her and his son comes in to stop him, and in a fit of rage he picks up his heavy staff and drives it through his son's skull, killing him. He went on a murder spree, wiping out entire villages because he thought that the nobles had plotted to kill his wife who died. So there's these fits of rage that come. When he was born, lightning struck the Kremlin, and he was born with three teeth. Once, so these fits of anger and rage, though, drive him to a degree. So yes, he's positive in that he westernized the place, but at the same time, he has these fits of anger and rage. And but he introduces Western ideas, but it's one step forward, two steps back, typically with Russia. Ivan died exactly on the night he was predicted to have died by a soothsayer while playing chess. At the stroke of midnight, he simply moved the piece and then died. So, and that then fed Russia. And then the problem is, too, you have these strong leaders that try to westernize Russia, and then when they die, there's no heir, and so it turns into a time of troubles where there's a fight over between the boyars on who are going to control the empire, and that led us into the next dynasty, which is the Romanovs. Through Michael Romanov, we get this new power. And eventually, from Alexei and Theodore, we end up with Peter the Great. Now, Peter at first was controlled by his sister, and then Peter takes her out and ends up coming to power. And you can tell by the way he's dressed. He's not dressed like we saw of Ivan. This new Romanov wants to westernize Russia and make it more like the West. And that's what he does. He does a lot of things that are westernized. Um, but at the same time, you're going to see these same old things we talked about from the Russians. Like, for example, these are examples of how he is going to westernize. One, he basically fights a huge war against the Swedes, defeats them, and then takes control of Estonia, Latvia, okay, and Lithuania. And then by doing that, and parts of Finland, and then he does what he creates this window on the west, which is St. Petersburg. This is St. Petersburg in the Winter Palace. This is Moscow. And and you see there's a difference between there's Eastern and Western, is that St. Petersburg is a window on the West. It looks like a Western city. He brings in costume balls. He introduces French into the court. He makes the nobles dress without the furs, like Westerners. He puts in a beard tax that charges men if they wear beards exorbitant amounts of money because he wants them to look Western. And so he does these Western ideas and he forces the nobles to move to here. After he builds this city in a swamp lowland, he builds this beautiful city that looks like you're in Paris or in the Dutch areas. Well, and so he introduces new scientific ideas. He introduces new military ideas. He himself went and posed as a commoner and learned how to build every ship of the line from England, even learning how to cast his own cannons. And then he comes back and builds the entire Russian fleet. He changed their uniforms to where they look like Western ideas. He introduced new taxation forms and new trade routes and new concepts. So he does this westernization of Russia by building St. Petersburg and putting in Western ideas, and introducing this new naval trade and naval power and this new military. However, he also eliminates all the people stand in his way. The Streltsy, the old nobility and the Streltsy, who are the guards of the Moscow garrison, when they won't take oaths to him, he has them executed. His own son rose up against him, tried to lead, was figured in a rebellion against the czar, and he had him tortured and killed. When people wouldn't shave their beards, he'd pour hot wax and rip them out. When one old man refused to wear a devil's costume to a costume ball, he had him stripped naked and had the horns glued to his head and stuck him on an ice floe in the middle of the river. So again, one step forward, one step back. So one thing he's also going to do, he bought, and there's another step forward, is that he does the table of ranks like we saw with the Hohenzollerns, and made nobles earn them. But all these reforms, like the westernization, are only happening to the top population. It's not happening to the 90% that are serfs. So, and religiously, he basically consolidates power under him. He's not allowing religious tolerance. He basically is doing a or doing a Henry VIII, but he can do that because he's already the patriarch. So that's how that works. And again, like most Russian leaders, he didn't pick an heir. And so when he dies in 1725 in pneumonia, he leaves no successor because he killed the one. And so Russia falls into another of these times of troubles. So, and so Russia is this strong handed conflict with the boyars, not progressing idea. Eastern Central Europe is a conflict between two German states, as one's growing in power with the Prussians, and the other one who's got a herd of cats it has to control in Austria, and a dying empire called the Holy Roman Empire. Poland is just going to get its butt kicked by everybody. Spain has died because of the religious wars that Philip is going to fight. And in France, you have the beginning of a French Revolution. The Dutch, as we're going to see, get eaten up by the English eventually, and England is becoming a constitutional monarch. So that's where we leave us.